you get busy with some character building task, you tune in to stimulate your mind while you're busy. So let's just jump right on in. This show is aimed at mature people who don't mind strong opinions and language because both may be expressed. I take full responsibility for my own opinions, and no platform or sponsor is liable for anything contained in this show. All my work falls under a Creative Commons Attribution license, so if you rebroadcast, reuse or redistribute this material, please make sure to credit me as the original creator. And enjoy the show. So hi everybody, welcome to the first episode of Bobbing Along, my new and improved show. Rebel Cat and I encountered some artistic differences which have led to us saying goodbye to each other for now. And I just want to take this opportunity to wish her all the best for her future plans. But to get on with today's show, we have Vince McLeod here, who's known as @VJM Publishing on Minds.com. He's come to speak to us a second time about his book Clown World Chronicles, which is available on Amazon and on Trade Me. Hi Vince, welcome to the show, and how are you doing today?
G'day Bob, thanks for having me on the show. I'm doing real well today. It's a very hot day here in Nelson and I'm feeling good.
Oh, awesome. Pretty warm here too. So Vince, let's just jump straight into it, because last time we talked, we looked briefly at how censorship has inspired you to establish your own publishing company in response to the sidelining of the conservative ideas of things like freedom of expression and uncontrolled information dissemination. So now I was wanting to ask you to take a deeper dive with us and look at some specifics, especially what you call alt-centrism. How would you define this alt-center?
Well, I consider myself an alternative centrist, and the essential test to tell if a person is an alternative centrist is that they don't like the establishment. They think the establishment is wrong. The establishment has failed. The political establishment needs to be altered, but that the alternative left and the alternative right are both dangerous extremists. Right. So if you believe in both of those two things, then you will rule out not only the establishment, but also the two major alternatives to the establishment. And that will leave you in the alternative center. So the test for being an alternative centrist is really that you reject all the previous political positions, but can still see some merit in them and understand why people supported those positions in the first place.
Awesome. I found that for myself too, is that I just don't know, I haven't known where to stand in current politics. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of people who actually are alternative centrists, but who haven't realized it yet.
Don't have the words. Yeah.
Yeah, as I said, the two questions, a lot of people agree with them. A lot of people agree that the establishment has failed. And they also agree that the alternative left and the alternative right are misguided, if not dangerous, if not extremists. So I think the alternative center is a political philosophy whose time is just coming now. It's just growing in power now. And I've found that there's a great number of people who are supportive of these ideas. And this reflects the fact that there are so many people out there who have also lost faith in the establishment and the major alternatives.
Yeah, real interesting. I think that's too. I found it very interesting reading your article, The 5 Rejections, where you talk about the things that the alt center has rejected. So I wanted to ask you something actually that came up in that piece for me. You wrote there that the alt center rejects all obsessions with degeneracy, purity, and wholesomeness. So I instantly understood what you meant about degeneracy, but I really didn't get why you say the alt center rejected purity and wholesomeness.
Here, I think it's important to make clear that the alternative center doesn't reject purity and wholesomeness so much as the obsessions with them. And that's one of the major distinctions between the alternative center and the alternative right. The alternative right, this being the fourth position, it's considered the fourth position in alternative centrist thought. A lot of them are about going back to religious fundamentalism, which didn't work for the establishment right, and which won't work for the alternative right. So the alternative center doesn't believe that an obsession with purity and wholesomeness will lead to actual purity and wholesomeness, but rather probably more self-righteousness and aggression and control of other people. And controlling others in that manner doesn't work, has led to so much discord. So the alternative centre rejects that.
That's interesting, because that's sort of, I can almost see that in spiritual terms as being the debauchery being extreme materialism, and the obsession with purity being extreme, some sort of religious fundamentalism.
Yeah, well, the alternative right is the position that's mostly concerned with degeneracy, because the alternative right is, in terms of the establishment, it's the left that's revolutionary, because the left is revolting against the establishment right, which is the one that inherited all the power. But in the alternative system, it's the alternative right, which are the revolutionaries, because they want to go back to what they believe to be the correct way of doing things in the past. They believe that the good times existed in the past and they want to go back to them. But the alternative centre doesn't believe that we can necessarily just turn the clock back. And so that's why the fourth position of the alternative right, it's accepted that the alternative right is correct when they say that we've gone far too far into materialism and the spiritual degeneracy that follows.
Yes.
But the alternative centre rejects the idea that we can simply go back to yesterday's religious dogma and expect that that'll function in any meaningful sense.
That's fantastic. I completely get behind you with that. I also agree with you when you talk about the establishment having like let us down and collapsed. And I think that for a long time I was listening to people who said we have to fix the system. I like it in your writing that you talk about replacing the system instead of fixing the system. You believe that the alt centre can take this back.
I think the alt centre can take us back to a system that actually functions. I mean, if that ever existed in the past, which it's not clear that it ever did. But the main thing is that the establishment doesn't want anything to change. And that's the basis of the alternative positions. The three alternative positions, the left, the centre and the right, all agree that the establishment needs to change, and perhaps even radically, if not even so far as to be totally overthrown. But the alternative centre is about finding a moderate position among those who believe in radical change. Now, that might sound paradoxical, but when you get down to it, it actually makes sense, because those who want radical change are often extremists, but there is a lot of value in their position if you drill down to the bottom of it.
It is interesting. It is interesting to look at extreme forms of thought. Your mind does want to reject extremity, doesn't it? There is this not collusion, but almost this drive towards unity.
Yeah, I think most people understand that extremism tends to lead to violence and chaos. But as far as the alternative centre is concerned, the alternative centre believes that because the establishment has failed, there has to be some major degree of change. But it's just that the alternative centre is in disagreement with the nature of the change desired by both the alternative left and the alternative right.
Yes.
The alternative right wanting to go back to some ideal society that may or may not have existed in the past, and the alternative left basically wants to wreck everything.
Yeah.
The alternative left doesn't seem to have any real plan or strategy for how it wants to introduce its change. It just wants to change. It just wants to introduce chaos into the system.
Yeah.
So the alternative centre rejects that. That's the fifth rejection.
Mm.
And that is true even though the alternative centre also accepts that the alternative left is correct when they say that our current system has far too much inequality, and that inequality is leading to suffering for a majority of the people.
Mm. Mm. It's so true. So the alt centre has the potential to become like the negotiator between these two sides.
That's correct. And you see that has already happened in the establishment with the establishment centre. The establishment centre, which is the third position, has successfully formed a coalition between the establishment right and the establishment left. And the third rejection of alternative centrist thought is the rejection of this establishment centrist position on the grounds that it is a sickly and weak compromise and does not hold to the truth enough. Third rejection is based on the idea that the establishment centre is mostly about just soulless capitalism and materialism, and that the form of peace that the establishment centre has established is not really a genuine peace so much as just a temporary form of submission.
Ah, right. Temporary form of submission. That's an interesting concept.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's really relevant when we're here with talking about these vaccine mandates and vaccine passports. We're talking about submission, sort of unthinking submission, which we're all coming up with, no, that's wrong.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem, is that the establishment maintains its position by forcing everybody else to submit to it. So that's why the establishment has so much power.
Mm.
But when it comes to things like vaccine mandates and other forms of authoritarianism, the alternative centre rejects all authoritarianism on the grounds that it doesn't actually lead to stability or happiness.
Gosh, interesting. Okay, so with some of these forces that are driving all this rampant change and undesirable change and this resentment-based aggression that you talk of, I've seen that a lot in the resentment towards white men and rich white men and rich dead white men and
Yeah.
anything that you want to be, you can resent.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that this complete and sort of mindless competition between left and right, man and woman, privilege and poverty, all these things are what have driven us into this polarized position. But you think that alt-centrists have resolved this?
Yeah, the alternative centre, the third acceptance of the alternative centrists is that the establishment centrists are correct when they believe that all the various parties must be brought together in some kind of unity. So the alternative centre agrees that it is necessary to accept the logic of all the other five political positions. It's just not necessary to accept them fully, 100%. So that's why the alternative centre both accepts and rejects all the previous five positions.
So that seems to suggest that it's the most rational of all the negotiating positions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I believe that the five acceptances and the five rejections rationally lay out the shortcomings and the advantages of all the previous five political positions. And so you could consider alt-centrism to be a kind of syncretic political philosophy, in much the same way that theosophy is a syncretic religious philosophy that takes the best of all of the Eastern religions, so that takes the best of Buddhism and Hinduism and Confucianism and Taoism and puts them together into one system. The alternative centre takes the best of the establishment right, the establishment left, the establishment centre, the alternative right and the alternative left, and puts all those into one system and intends to leave out the bad aspects of those other five positions, the extremism, the unwillingness to work together, and also the sickly compromise that is the establishment centre. Because nobody's happy with the sickly compromise that the establishment centre has brought into place. And that's why there's so much alternative, there are so many alternative movements and so much power behind these alternative movements.
How interesting. So you think that you often mention the sort of spiritual thing, and you're bringing the Eastern religions quite strongly into play here, but you're quite against how do you say it? Abrahamism?
Abrahamism, yeah.
Abrahamism. So
Well,
why do you criticize it?
The first acceptance
Yes.
of alternative centrist thought is that the establishment right is correct when they say that society fundamentally has to be orderly. Without order, society can't exist. We go back to a state of nature like basic apes and just go back to extreme levels of violence. So the alternative centre accepts that the establishment right is correct when they say that society is based on order, and that order is the basis of everything good in the world. However, the alternative centre also rejects, the first rejection is the rejection of the religious dogma that is pushed from the establishment right. because that religious dogma is fundamentally totalitarian, and that is what leads to the chaos of revolution when it gets rejected. There's an essay on my company page that says alternative centrism is necessarily a spiritual movement. And the reason for that is because the other 5 positions don't really accept genuine spirituality. You've got the establishment right, which is where all the theocrats are, which is something that grew out of the total domination of Europe by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. And then you have the establishment left, which is completely godless. They are the Marxists and the communists who reject everything about the establishment right, even the good things. And then you have the alternative centre, which doesn't care about spirituality at all because they're only into money. All they care about is profit and capital. And then you have the alternative right, which is probably the most spiritual of the other 5 positions, but they are not so much about exploring genuine spirituality as simply going back to the dogma of the establishment right. And then you have the alternative left, and they're not spiritual at all either. They're another extension of the same Marxist materialism that characterizes the establishment left. So the alternative centre has found itself almost by default as the only position that's willing to champion a true spirituality.
Right. That's kind of problematic for me a little bit, because I reckon that sort of 80% of the people that are around us haven't got the energy or the inclination to pursue the spiritual needs of society. And so we lack the compassion that we need for other people in order to function as one spiritual whole. So how does the alt-centrists, how do they reach everybody with this message of spirituality? It's such an individual decision, but it's so vital to the way forward for the alt-centre.
The alternative centre, it's not hard to reach people in this manner because so many people are desperate for genuine spirituality.
Right.
You've got basically 2 different forms there are 2 different spiritual approaches at the moment in the modern world, and this is referred to in Clown World Chronicles as the Clown World Fork, where people are forced to decide between either fanatical dogma on the one hand or a complete rejection of all spirituality on the other. And so the alternative centre, it's about striking the correct balance between these 2 extremes.
So you feel that it's sort of a ground roots movement born out of just the position where we are in Clown World, and that's
well, all of the alternative positions are really grassroots movements,
right.
Because the establishment positions, they're established, right? I mean, you have the establishment right, which is basically the power structure that has always existed going back thousands of years. You have the establishment left, which is the now well-established Marxist and communist tradition, who are realistically part of the establishment now, whether they accept that or not. Like, you look at the Labour Party. The Labour Party is not a revolutionary party in any meaningful sense. They are simply the establishment, but with a perhaps more feminine and compassionate face.
Right.
So they're not accepted by alternative centrists either.
Very interesting. So here I'm going to quote you again. You say that it's the fear of change that pushes people into conservatism, and that right-wing cruelty and greed walk hand in hand. And I know from my studies that it's true that as wealth increases, compassion decreases. And so therefore, without compassion, you can run wild with your greed. So if we got to a place where our country was run along the lines of alt-centrist policies, how would we guard against hoarding of wealth by the avaricious?
That would be achieved mostly through the 3rd rejection. The 3rd rejection, again, is the rejection of the establishment centre. The establishment centre being the money worshippers who really want the establishment centre. Their main motivation for finding agreement between the establishment right and the establishment left is because war and conflict is bad for business. All the establishment centre really wants is money, and the alternative centre rejects them on the count of that their obsession with money and materialism doesn't leave any room for spirituality, and therefore doesn't allow for any genuine happiness.
Interesting. No genuine happiness. That sounds to be pretty much like what clown world is at the moment.
Yeah, well, the idea is that clown world really is mostly a function of the fact that the establishment does not change anymore. The establishment has really led us down a very bad path, and that it doesn't seem like there's any realistic way to change them easily. It seems like the establishment is so deeply entrenched that it's difficult to find any realistic alternative. And that's where the alternative centre also rejects the left, who basically wants to wreck everything, and the right, who wants to go back to some idealized past that probably never existed.
So in the book Clown World Chronicles, you have Honkler, who's sort of the leader of the Peppies, the great force of humor and compassion and everything. What other memes have we got that help us to understand alt-centrism?
Well, the clown world pantheon is really more of a it's more of a spiritual concept that's not directly related to alternative centrism. It's the alternative centrism understands that there has to be a role for spirituality in human life, otherwise we just get lost. We get lost in excessive order, or we get lost in excessive chaos, or we get lost in excessive materialism, or such things. And so the alternative centre believes that if you take the case of Honkler is really a spiritual force that's emanating down from above into clown world as a result of the will of Kek being considered the highest god. Yeah. Kek is believed to be, in Clown World Chronicles, Kek is described as the elder god of the fundamental positive axis, which is to say that he is, at his will to bring humor to all of us and bring joy to all of us, is fundamentally what brings happiness into clown world. And so the alternative centre would say that this new form of this new way of spiritual thinking is necessary to overcome the dogma that we've inherited from the establishment right, as well as the soulless nihilism that we've inherited from the establishment left. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's about striking a rational compromise between the two false dilemmas of the clown world fork, the two prongs of the clown world fork. Instead of being forced to choose either one of them, it's a matter of going in the middle and finding something that's better than either.
Right, yes. So this force of joy and happiness and humor and everything, again, to me, it brings back this very millennial attitude of compassion, and how compassion is the thing that's going to help us get through. But how do we stimulate compassion amongst these sort of establishment people who for years and years and years have only had money as their god?
I don't know if it can be stimulated among the establishment. I think the establishment kind of has to either be destroyed or just left to die, because the establishment's mostly full of boomers, right? And they are shuffling off this mortal coil. So it's not really an imperative to convince the members of the establishment that spirituality is correct. However, the alternative centre believes that if we can display the right example of moral and spiritual rectitude, that the other alternative sides, the alternative left and the alternative right, will naturally come to us, and they'll naturally come to follow us in the belief that we have shown the way forward. So the establishment really is something that we've written off in alternative centrist thought. Okay. But the other alternative positions, although they may be misguided, they're not fundamentally worth writing off.
Right. So where you see the right being cruel and greedy, you see the left wing as being short-sighted and naive and reckless. So this is really mentally ill, really bipolar. Yeah. And what you're suggesting is spirituality as a cure to the mental illness of clown world. Am I right?
That's right. Yep. We well, the belief is that that's why the third section of Clown World Chronicles is entirely devoted to this new conception of spirituality relating to the Clown World pantheon and Honker and Keck and Pepe and all the others, because it's clear that in order for people to be compassionate towards each other, they have to recognize that which has value in each other, and that which has value in each other is not the physical forms that we have in our bodies, but what has value in each other is the spirit that fundamentally ensouls these physical forms.
Right.
And so without an understanding that there is a divine nature in every human being, which is something recognized by the Hindus, that's why they say namaste, which is a way of saying that they bow to the divine in other people. The alternative center believes that such a concept has to come back so that we can recognize the divine in others. Without a recognition of this divine spark in other people, the tendency is to fight and try and destroy them and wipe them out. But the alternative center doesn't believe that you can truly respect other people unless you understand that they're also expressions of the divine in the same way that we are.
Gosh. So, wow, that's so deep. That's
yeah, it's wicked, but that's why I think the alternative center is the answer to the problems that we're facing. I think that if you look at the third rejection, a part of it is that the establishment center is shallow. The establishment center is shallow, and it's mostly the establishment center is the vibe that you get from the television when it's advertising to you.
right.
It's the capitalist vibe, the corporate vibe, the one that doesn't care about much other than just profit and gain. And the alternative center understands that this obsession with materialist gain is not going to lead to anywhere good. And you can already see that it's caused a lot of problems for a lot of people. But that's the basis of establishment thought, is all coming together to make money. Right. And all of the alternative positions reject that. The alternative left rejects the obsession with money on the grounds that money's not important. The alternative right rejects the obsession with money on the grounds that they want to go back to a more spiritual way of thinking. And the alternative center, of course, rejects it because it can accept that both the alternative left and the alternative right, they have a good point when they say those things.
Yes. So where we have class interests maybe above national interests, we get people segregated, and therefore they are easily manipulated, and the political class, as we know, are full of unscrupulous people. So in clown world, we've seen the diversification of many Western nations by the influx of refugees and all sorts of immigration from disadvantaged countries and things. So within this environment, this diversified, maybe even diversified against our will environment, where is our hope for returning to national identity?
Well, the concept of national identity can't really survive multiculturalism, because the word nation is cognate with the word natal, and it relates to birth. The idea of a nation is that a nation is supposed to be a group of people who are related to each other by birth, in other words, by blood. So it's a nation is essentially an extended kinship group, like a massive family. And that can't survive multiculturalism. If you have a massive number of refugees or immigrants from another bloodline who come into the same territory, but who aren't actually part of the same nation, then the inevitable result is conflict. But that was planned by the establishment from the beginning, because the establishment has always known that in order to maintain its position, it has to divide and conquer the lower classes, and it has to set them against each other. Now, if you go back 1,000 years, 1,200 years, the way that the establishment maintained its position was by introducing Christianity to the population, because they understood that if half of the population was Christian, the other half of the population was not Christian, then they'd just fight each other all the time, and the establishment could just sit there and just rule over them. And they did that perfectly well for about 1,000 years until the history had advanced so far that we started moving out of the age of Pisces and that meant that the Abrahamic religions started to lose their power.
Mm.
But the problem is that hasn't actually been replaced by something that can hold us all together. So what they have done is, instead of using religious belief to divide and conquer the people, they allowed for mass immigration, and they allowed that kind of the natural conflict that arises from diversity. They allowed that to divide and conquer the people instead. So really what the establishment has done, they've just used mass immigration to entrench their position in the same way that they used religious diversity to entrench their position 1,000 years ago. But really it's another example of the same phenomenon, which is that if you can introduce diversity into a group of people, you also introduce chaos to that group of people, and that makes it much harder for that group of people to come together as a unified force to oppose you.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, Kek's already won.
Well, Kek has won. It's just a matter of going through the motions. But Kek's major way of influencing the world is to give power to Honkler. Honkler is the avatar of the will of Kek. So Honkler represents the same energy as Mercury represented in the ancient Greco-Roman pantheons, as a messenger of God. Kek being equal to God in the clown world pantheon sense.
Yes.
So Honkler is his avatar, and the point of the mission of Honkler is to bring joy into clown world, and that aspect of things is based on the understanding that it's really misery that is the basis of so many of our problems. Like, there are so many people who are unhappy today in clown world, and that is a result of the fact that we've lost our spiritual core. We've lost the spiritual battle.
Right. Yes. So yes, we have, and yet within that loss there is already the victory. It's like the Phoenix story, isn't it?
It is, and that's represented by the quadrigetu, which is the symbol that I was wearing on my shirt in the image that you put up on the previous podcast that we did.
Yes.
The quadrigetu, just like the yin yang symbol, which is called the taijitu, represents the fact that when things get really bad, they inevitably start getting better again, because that's the cycle of existence. Yeah. It's like a gigantic sine wave. Things get good, then they get worse, then they get better, then they get worse.
So I read your national alt-centrism essay, and you ask in there, you say, you pose the alt question, do we submit or do we rebel? What is your alt answer to that question? Do we submit or do we rebel?
Well, answering that question really is a matter of asking yourself if things are tolerably good the way they are now. If you can tolerate the way things are now, then there's no real need to rebel. You might as well just live your life. But if you are enduring an intolerable degree of humiliation and poverty and misery on account of the fact that, take for example, our Western economies are structured so that it's almost impossible to own a house through your own labour, and that is really a recipe for widespread immiseration of the population. Yes. So it's things like that have to be considered.
Interesting. You talk about also the balance fallacy of philosophy when you explain these things. I don't understand that at all. What is the balance fallacy?
The balance fallacy is the idea that if you have two conflicting positions, then some middle position between them must inevitably be the most true and correct one. So this relates to the third rejection of alternative centrism, because the establishment centre is really trying to the establishment centre is the balance fallacy writ large, because the establishment centre has just said, okay, we'll take a little bit from the establishment right and a little bit from the establishment left, and we'll just meet in the middle and try and get rich. If we all try and get rich, then we don't have to worry about things like ideology. We don't have to worry about things like spirituality. We all get rich, and then that's it. And then everything else takes care of itself. The alternative centre believes that this is a fallacious form of reasoning, because truth is higher than expedience. And if truth is the highest value, as the theosophists say, there is no religion higher than truth. So if truth is truly the highest value, then everything else must be subordinate to that. And that means that you don't necessarily take the middle position between the two conflicting sides. It might be possible that one of the two sides is entirely correct and the other side is entirely wrong. And so the alternative centrists, we reject the alternative centre on the grounds that they have fallen victim to this balance fallacy, and the alternative centre is happy. We are happy to take extremist ideas from any of the other previous 5 positions, even if they might sound extremist, because in rejecting the balance fallacy, the alternative centre understands and accepts that there must be, therefore, forms of extremism. And we're not against extremism necessarily. It's just that extremism usually doesn't work out so well, but in some cases it does. Like if you take, for example, if you look throughout history, it's very rare that there's any significant social change without there first being an outburst of violence.
Right.
And so the alternative centre will say that the establishment centre is entirely wrong when it puts compromise above all other considerations. And the alternative centre accepts that the alternative right and the alternative left have got a valuable point when they try and instigate some kind of revolutionary chaos. We don't entirely reject that.
Yes. And I like it the way when you explain the alt centre in your essays, you talk about extracting ideas from both sides, but you don't make those ideas into a third thing. You keep these two disparate groups of opinions, and you somehow, I was going to say balance, but that's maybe not. What is it?
Well, it is a form of balance. The alternative centre is definitely being centrist. We are definitely about striking a balance, but it is an alternative balance. It's not the establishment balance, which is a weak and sickly form of, I suppose you could call it tolerance without any principles. It's a kind of unprincipled tolerance in the sense that it just accepts everything. The establishment centre really accepts everything, no matter how degenerate, no matter how soulless or materialist. And the alternative centre rejects that on the grounds that these kind of compromises, they may produce a good result in the short term, but they've led to Western society getting stuck in a kind of rut that we're having trouble getting out of, because the runaway materialism and consumerism is wrecking us. It's wrecking our societies, it's wrecking the environment, and it has already wrecked our souls. Yeah. Because people don't find and cannot find a purpose in life through merely consuming material goods and services. And the alternative centre accepts that there has to be more to life than just consumption.
So you're going out and you're talking to people about this, and this is a really, really small country, so we're going to need to talk to lots of people overseas. How has your message been received by overseas people?
Well, it's been received really well, especially by Americans, because I think Americans in particular, that's where, in America more than anywhere else, that's where you can see that the problems of the political establishment have become acute. Because it's really America that decided that there was going to be a compromise between the establishment right and the establishment left in the first place. So what I've found is that pretty much everyone I speak to in the Western world understands that there is a need for the philosophy of alternative centrism. And that's why I say that alternative centrism is a philosophy whose time has now come. Because other people understand that most other people intuitively accept the same 5 acceptances. Most people intuitively accept that not only does there have to be order, but there also has to be freedom, and that there has to be a compromise, and that there has to be truth and honesty, and there has to be justice. So I think most people are naturally upset by the way clown world is, and most people want an alternative. But most people understand. Most people don't trust the major alternative positions. The average person in the street, he doesn't look at the alternative right and see really rational people. And that's true also of the alternative left. No, it's rare that somebody looks at the alternative left and thinks that these are people who should be at the top of the position, who should be in charge. And so the alternative center is about accepting that and trying to find a balance without it becoming a sickly compromise.
Mm. So you talked earlier about how there's an outbreak of violence or aggression or whatever before there's social change. But at the moment, I'm mostly seeing a lot of fear. Do you think fear is the fuel for that violence that people are expecting?
Yeah, I would argue that all violence, just about all violence, is fundamentally based in fear.
Uh-huh.
Because the point of fear is to protect yourself. And the point of violence is to protect yourself. And the will to protect yourself ultimately is driven by fear. But so the alternative center understands that there is an extremely elevated risk of widespread violence on account of the widespread fear that exists in Western world today at the moment. There are basically, it seems like just about everybody is afraid of the future because young people are looking at how difficult it is to own a home today, and there doesn't seem like there's any good news on the horizon when it comes to economic news. It doesn't seem like there's any real prospect of things changing significantly enough so that it becomes realistic to own a house off your own labor anymore. So I think today there is more fear in society than has existed at any point since probably before the Industrial Revolution, or maybe never even before. Because you can say, I mean, World War I, World War II, they were horrific events. But even those who fought in World War I, World War II, those who endured those events, they generally believed that if they endured them, then things were going to get better and the world was going to become good and we were going to end up in a good place. But now people look at the suffering that we're undergoing, and there isn't a lot of faith that if we do endure that things are going to get better. Many people believe that things are just going to get worse and worse, and that's led to levels of fear that I personally believe are unprecedented. I don't think that we've ever been this afraid and this hopeless in the history of Western civilization, unless you'd have to go back to the Dark Ages and the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, interesting. So one of the points that you make really well in the book Clown World is that reality is broken and nobody knows anymore what actual reality is. But I think that you have some ideas about the true nature of reality, don't you?
Yeah, well, this comes back to alternative centrism being fundamentally a spiritualist movement. And here we're starting to move out of my political philosophy and move more into my spiritual philosophy, which is called Elementalism. And the first tenet of Elementalism is that consciousness itself is the prima materia and therefore the basis of reality. And so the material world is considered by elementalists to be a dream that God has dreamed up for the sake of entertainment. So as such, the physical forms that appear before us in this reality aren't fundamentally real. What's fundamentally real is the fragment of consciousness that ensouls those forms. That fragment of consciousness is a fragment of God. And so each one of us are ensouled by a fragment of God that is eternal and cannot be destroyed. So the belief is that even if you take, it's obvious that physical forms in this reality all change and that they're all impermanent and that they all disappear. But what's fundamentally important about these forms are that they are ensouled by a fragment of consciousness. And that fragment of consciousness continues to exist after the death of the physical form because consciousness is understood to be the primary basis of reality and therefore cannot be destroyed.
So when you talk about God dreaming this dream, I have a theory that there's no such thing as God, but there is in fact a force which I liken to the force of gravity that works everywhere and holds everything together. And I like to call that force love. And I wonder if we look at love as being an actual conscious, sentient entity, if those ideas of God dreaming could be this is love's outplaying of itself. This is what love ideally is, striving for something. And this is why alt-centrism, which is a political movement, is so linked in with spirituality.
Yeah, no, I believe that's true, because if you look at the other 5 political positions,
Yes.
none of them are characterized by love. The establishment right is characterized by a will to hold control and order at all costs. The establishment left are mostly motivated by a hatred of the establishment right and a will to destroy them. The establishment centre are motivated by, you could argue that they were the most loving of the other 5 positions, but it's a kind of indulgent love, which is not really rectitudinous, but more permissive. The alternative right openly doesn't care about love at all. I mean, they openly talk about eugenics and destroying their enemies and wiping them all out. And the alternative left obviously isn't about love either, although they claim to be an anti-hate movement. But it's obvious to anybody who observes them that their anti-hate is really just another form of hate. And so the alternative centrist would say that the other 5 positions, they don't represent love in any meaningful sense. In fact, the alternative centrist would say that the other 5 positions are really expressions of man's base material nature, and for this base material nature, politics is merely a way of getting one's will through in the physical world. So the alternative centre steps back from all that and says, okay, all of these previous political positions, they haven't actually led to anything good, on account of that they don't have love as their fundamental motivation. Their fundamental motivation is material desire and physical control. And so the alternative centre steps back from all that, and that concept of love is also the basis of the 5 acceptances, because love is necessary to accept that somebody who you disagree with politically is not necessarily evil and has at least some rational reasons for believing what they do, even if those reasons aren't perfectly accurate or good enough by themselves. The love of the alternative centre nevertheless accepts that there is some value in all of these other positions. So we reject this is part of the second rejection, which is the second rejection is a rejection of the will to destruction that you have seen expressed by the establishment left all throughout history. So we reject that those more bestial and materialistic motivations.
And when you say we, how many of you do you think there are at this time? I mean, obviously it's still quite an early emerging political and spiritual groundswell. But I mean, you have your finger on the pulse, so you can be you're more aware of how many people are turning towards this idea.
Well, it's certainly true that there are very few people who consciously identify with the alternative centre, but that's not because the main reason for that is because of the massive propaganda that's pushed on everybody by the establishment sides. All 3 of the establishment sides, they all work together to create a media control system so that people's perceptions are completely controlled by the mainstream media, and so that they can't get anywhere. So I would say that even though there's very few people who currently identify with the alternative centre, I would say that there are a great number of people, perhaps even as much as 25-30% of the population, who agree with the 2 questions of alternative centrism, which is that you reject the establishment and that you also reject the dangerous extremists in the alternative left and the alternative right. I'd say that there's probably maybe even 40% of the population agrees with the idea that the establishment has failed, but that the alternative left and the alternative right are both dangerous extremists. So I'd say that, alternative centrism really is a philosophy whose time is coming, because people are increasingly waking up to the fact that it answers a lot of the questions that have been posed by the failures of the previous 5 systems.
So this is really, alt-centrism really includes this return to spirituality and strengthens the bonds between these diverse groups that have been built into our current Western culture by these, well, what would you call them? The political actors who are trying to divide and conquer, have brought in this diversity, and yet the spirituality that you're speaking about appears to me to be the glue that we could use to form a new, I guess, a new type of community, that people can have these strong bonds.
Yeah, I believe it, because without spirituality, I don't believe that you can really have strong bonds. I mean, in a state of nature, you can have kinship bonds based on family and so on, bonds of blood relations. But if you're going to have if you're going to have a country where there is a great deal of diversity, you have to find something more fundamental than mere kinship bonds if you're going to get along with everybody. And that something is going to have to be a recognition of the divine nature of all of us. So that's why the alternative center believes that, yes, spirituality, and in particular the empathy that comes from recognizing the divine in each other, that empathy is necessary for an acceptable level of political conduct to be possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at the previous 5 conditions,
yes.
You look at the previous 5 positions, none of them are characterized by empathy. The establishment right, they'd be perfectly happy if we still lived like in Dark Ages Europe, where the king and his priests were still completely in control of everything. The establishment left, they don't care about empathy. They see their opponents as purely evil. They see their opponents as just something that really needs to be destroyed. The establishment centre doesn't have any empathy either, because perhaps they have more than the others, but as mentioned before, they mostly care about just wealth. And of course, the alternative left and the alternative right, neither of them are characterised by empathy either. So really, these 5 political positions, they have all failed, and that's why the alternative centre has the 5 rejections. All 5 of those positions are rejected for a variety of reasons, but really it does fundamentally boil down to the fact that none of them have the spiritual rectitude to recognise the value of other people, and as such, their arrogance leads them to conflict and fighting, discord.
Yeah. Well. So you say that the praised man in clown world is the biggest parasite of us all, and he's the biggest hoarder of resources. But then in the new reality, the ideal man is one who's achieved peace and rectitude. And you infer that this back-to-front reasoning could be what has led to the extinction of is leading to the extinction of our culture. So what is the way that the alt center can lead us back to balance between men and women? Or do you think that the chasm is too wide now to be crossed?
No, I don't believe it is too wide, because if you believe that spirituality is the fundamental basis of reality, then all things are possible. Even if they may seem to be materially impossible, that doesn't matter, because even though the material world may be characterized by conflict at all levels, that's not the fundamental basis of reality. And as such, the alternative center tries to focus on something deeper. So the alternative center doesn't look at people as just, let's say, primates that evolved in a situation of resource conflict, as all of the other animals in the natural world did, but rather as a spiritual expression that is experiencing the illusion of the material world. And so it's not necessary to fight over everything.
Right.
When it comes to men and women, though, I think it's important to point out that the right-wing positions, both the establishment right and the alternative right, they have a lot more male supporters.
Yes.
The establishment right really is the patriarchy of old school ways of thinking. And the alternative right, they are also extremely masculine. Like, there are very few female thinkers among alternative right people. And the opposite is true in the left. The establishment left might not be particularly feminine, but the alternative left certainly is. Like if you look at the social justice warriors, the Green Party, for example, and other such, really they are reactionaries. The vast majority of them are female. So the alternative centre is, in the sense that it tries to strike a balance between many things, it also tries to strike a balance between masculine and feminine, in the sense that we don't believe that either masculinity or femininity is superior to the other in a political sense. Although we accept the masculinity of, the first acceptance is the acceptance of the need for order. And so we do accept that the masculinists are right when they say that order does need to be imposed upon society. But we also accept that the feminists are right when they say that some degree of freedom is necessary. So it is about striking the correct compromise between those two extremes.
Mm. It needs to be a working partnership, doesn't it? Between actual, and in a way, man is the one extreme and woman is the other extreme, and the baby is the compromise.
Yeah, it's like that. But of course, the baby will be either male or female and will grow up to take one of the two positions. And so that's why you can never have perfect peace. I mean, the alternative centre, we don't believe in the idea of escaping the conflict of the material world. I mean, we believe that it's not possible to find a state of perfect bliss in which there is no conflict. And even if it was, it would not be desired, because it would so rapidly become boring that anybody subjected to it would start desiring chaos just out of sheer boredom.
Sheer boredom, wow.
So that's why we believe it's necessary to strike the correct balance, and not really just a not finding the middle ground in all cases, but finding the truth above all.
Above all, yes.
Yeah.
So tell us why people should buy, or tell the people why they should buy Clown World Chronicles from you off Trade Me or Amazon.
Well, if you have recognized that the political problems in today's society don't look like they're being solved anytime soon, if you recognize that the established powers of the Western world are not leading us to a place of happiness, if you accept that the way that things are being run is increasing the human misery in the world, and that this looks like continuing to increase, then you should buy Clown World Chronicles and read about why society has got bad in the first place, and the fundamental mechanisms that have led to it becoming the way that it is. Because Clown World Chronicles explains the descent of all the political positions from the initial state of the establishment right controlling everything. So Clown World Chronicles is really a way of chronicling the chaos that has arisen from the inability of the previous 5 political positions to create a worthwhile political reality.
Well, once again, this has been an absolutely fabulous discussion, and I'm so sad that it's come to the end. And I need to say to you again, let's do another one.
Oh, yeah.
But for now, thank you very, very much, Vince, for joining us this afternoon and for shedding some light on that. And I hope that we see you again soon.
No problem, Bob. No, it's my pleasure to come on your show and talk about alternative centrism, and I'd love to come back another time. Perhaps after my next book, which is going to be called Elementalism, is finished. Perhaps I could come on and talk about that again. The next book, Elementalism, is more of a discussion of the spiritual realities, and it's not really directly related to alternative centrism, but is kind of a necessary component of it.
Yes.
And so, this next book is going to explain in more detail a lot of these ideas that have to be understood if the alternative centrist position is to be fully understood.
Yeah.
So, thanks so much for having me on your show. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. Me too. I'm learning so much. Every time I talk to you, I feel that I have one more block in my little wall of understanding.
Oh, good.
All right. See you again soon then.
All right. Cheers, Bob. Okay. Catch you next time.
Cheers. Thank you for listening. To support me in my ventures, please subscribe, tip, and remind my content here on minds.com. If you're not yet a member of Minds, hop on over and set up your own free and uncensored channel. Remember to come back next week to catch the next in the series Bobbing Along from @BobDub on Minds.com. This has been a Bobcat production. Subscribe now, and until next time, so long. Bob, bob, bobbing, bob, bob, bobbing, bobbing along, bobbing along, bob, bob, bobbing, bob, bob, bobbing, bobbing along.